Hey, grade 9, we're continuing on with environmental chemistry and talking about topic 2, which is called a growing concern. What it's about is actually about pesticides, learning about pesticides, the benefits, and then also the dangers of pesticides. And then related to that is the idea of biomagnification. And that's just all about how things that make it into food chains get higher in concentration and more dangerous the higher up we are in the food chain, which is really important for humans because we're at the top of the food chain. So here are the objectives or what we're going to learn. You're going to learn the differences between herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. You're going to learn the dangers of chemical pesticides. We're going to look specifically at a pesticide called DDT that maybe you've heard of, very famous pesticide that's still used in some parts of the world today. You're going to learn about the process of biomagnification, also called bioaccumulation, and how pests become resistant to pesticides, and then also a little bit about organic farming while we're on the topic of pesticides. So to start out, let's talk about these basic definitions, and these terms you have to know, but they're so easy. So we talk about a pesticide. Well, what is a pesticide? It's basically just anything that kills something that we call a pest. So a chemical agent used to kill or control pest populations. Now this could be insects, it could be rodents, it could be weeds. It doesn't matter. It's anything that kills what we would consider a pest. So for example, a herbicide is used to kill or control plant pest populations. And you can understand this just simply because it has the word herb in it. And you know that herbs are plants. So herbicides are used to kill or control plants. Fungicides has fungus or fungi right in the term, in the word. So that's used to kill or control fungi or different types of fungus. Okay, so for example, molds, right, would be a fungus. Mold would be a type of fungus, so it would actually then kill the mold that would be on, crops or whatever. Like athlete's foot treatments, that's actually a fungicide that you're using. And then finally, insecticides, that is used to kill or control insects. So this is so easy because it's right in the word. Herbicides for herbs, fungicides for fungi, insecticides for insects. Pesticides, the over umbrella of those, is for all pests. So typically we just talk about pesticides, right? But that's a very general term. If we want to be more specific, we can use these three terms below. All right, so let's move on from there. These are some advertisements that are kind of showing different types of pesticides. I might link a few in the Edpuzzle here so you can view them. So let's talk about what the pros and cons of pesticides are. Why do we actually use them? What's the point? Why are they beneficial to our society? Well, the pros of pesticides is, and I'll just move this aside, is that it allows for us to have larger crop production. So if we have pesticides, we can get, as a result, larger crops because they're not destroyed or eaten by pests, and they're typically going to be higher quality. And good crops means more money for the farmers, right? So if they can produce more and get more money using pesticides, well then it's probably going to happen. What are the cons? What are the dangers and problems with pesticides? Well, it can be harmful to non-target organisms. So by non-target, it's what the pesticide is not trying to kill. We want it to be harmful to target organisms, but we don't want it to kill other things. So for example, there are some insects that are beneficial. So think about ladybugs. Ladybugs eat aphids. So they're actually great at taking care of a pest, the aphids, that would normally actually be on, let's say, plants or whatever. But if we also are killing the ladybugs, right, with the pesticide spray we use, the insecticide, then that would be bad because now we're actually getting rid of something that normally would do good. It enters the food chain. So when we spray pesticides, we end up eating the food, and then it's in the food chain, or whatever actually is exposed to the pesticide ends up having it in their bodies, and it's part of the food chain. When it makes it into water, this is especially true in aquatic ecosystems, and it can cause something called biomagnification or bioaccumulation. So what this means is that we're going to go through it in detail in a little bit here, but as we get higher and higher up the food chain, the concentration of the pesticide ends up being higher as well, which can cause more negative effects on things higher up the food chain than it did on things lower in the food chain. So one way that we can see some negative effects of a pesticide is to look at a famous pesticide called DDT. DDT is a pesticide that was used widely back in like the 50s and the 60s, and I think even a little bit earlier than that. It's still used today in some poorer countries with less regulations, but yeah, its real name is dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. The structure of it is actually on the next slide right here, so that's what it looks like. Where each one of these points is actually a carbon atom, and there's some hydrogens attached to there as well, but there you have it. So that's the real name of this. You don't have to memorize that. You don't have to know it. It's just interesting. And it's a persistent pesticide that stays in the environment for long periods of time. Let's talk about that term persistent. It actually is defined right there in that sentence. When I talk about something that's a persistent pollutant, that means that it is staying for a long period of time in the environment. So it doesn't end up getting degraded or broken down easily. Instead, it sticks around as it is. So if I were to talk about waste that is persistent, styrofoam would be a really good example because it doesn't break down easily. Okay, so when I talk about a persistent chemical, a persistent pollutant, it does not break down quickly. It stays together. It's very chemically stable. So as a result, it can make it through food chains and stuff, and the effects of it are going to be felt for a really long time because it doesn't get broken down. It doesn't go away quickly. During the Second World War, DDT was produced to stop typhus, which is transmitted by lice. So really useful pesticide. Here's an ad around it. I'll probably link another video that shows a guy walking through a cloud of DDT. There's like this whole thing about how, it doesn't hurt humans at all. It's fantastic. Look at how safe it is. You can drink it. And you know, people did ridiculous things with the DDT showing how safe it was, but in all reality, it actually is a carcinogen. It causes cancer. I think it causes some nerve issues as well, but it also disrupts food chains and food webs and is bad in the ecosystem. So even though it makes it seem like, hey, it's not a danger at all, it actually was a concern, and they found that out later on as more data came in and more evidence of the negative effects it was having, and they could tie those negative effects to concentration of DDT. So DDT being in these living organisms that were suffering as a result of exposure. So here is a food chain. And on the food chain, you can see that water has a very low concentration of DDT. That's ppm, stands for parts per million. You're going to learn more about those units for concentration later on. But that means that 0.000003 parts for every million parts was DDT when you look at mass. Well, because the zooplankton lived in the water, it ends up actually accumulating in their tissue. And so what's happening there is that because they're ingesting the water and the water is coming into them and it's a persistent pollutant, so it doesn't break down in their bodies, it ends up concentrating there and it ends up being 0.04 ppm. Well, then small fish end up eating the zooplankton. Now it's at 0.5 ppm. Large fish eat a bunch of small fish and it accumulates in there again. And now I have 2 parts per million in the large fish. And then when I have fish eating birds of prey that eat a bunch of these large fish over their lifetime, well, then they get a high concentration, right? So now they have 25 parts per million. So we ended up actually increasing the concentration from the water to the bird by, I don't even know how many times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 10 million times larger in concentration, approximately, in the bird than in the water, which is absolutely incredible. And that's what happens again with a persistent pollutant that doesn't get broken down in organisms, as it keeps on building up and building up and building up. And the higher up the food chain you are, the more stuff you eat that also ate stuff, the higher the concentration you're going to have inside of you of those pollutants. Right now you might be thinking, well, wait, I eat a lot of stuff that eats stuff. Yeah, you probably have a really high concentration of some pollutants inside of you. It's a thing that happens. So think about, like, for example, PCBs, polychlorobiphenyls. You probably have a lot of PCBs inside of you, which are a persistent pollutant that we have quite a bit of. And yeah, it's true. So this is something that happens in our bodies, and if the concentration gets high enough, it can cause us possible issues. Anyways, I would like you to read pages 189 and 190 in your textbook, and I'm going to link to the PDF in the Edpuzzle so you can read it over carefully, and then we're going to have some questions on the next page for you to go through. So leave it open after you have read it so that you can look for the answers to these questions if you don't remember. Okay, so the first question I'll ask you in relation to the pages you read is, how does DDT enter the food web? So how do we, first of all, actually get the DDT pesticide into the food web? Question number 2, which organism shown in the food web contains the highest concentration of DDT? And here, if you take a look, you can see that the seabirds are at 2800 ppb, but the dolphins end up eating more of the stuff and larger in mass, so it makes sense. They're at 5200 ppb, parts per billion. In other words, 5.2 parts per million. So they have the highest concentration. Which organism is at a higher trophic level, dolphins or plankton? Trophic level just means how high up they are on the food chain. So dolphins are higher in trophic level than plankton is. So dolphin would be the right answer there. In the food web, how many times greater is the concentration of DDT in the fish than in the water? Well, fish, I have 43 ppb, and seawater, I have 0.0001. So what is that going to give me? 430,000? 430,000, yeah, 430,000 times larger should be the right answer for that. 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm just having a hard time seeing all the zeros, to be honest. Yes, 430,000, final answer, moving on. Here's another kind of quick reading that you can see in your textbook as well, but hopefully you can read it off of this page, and I'm gonna read it to you, save you the trouble. In 1995, the World Health Organization sprayed dieldrin, I don't actually know how to say that, a chemical pesticide similar to DDT on North Borneo to control malarial mosquitoes. Although the mosquitoes were almost completely eliminated, so were the lizards that fed on the dead insects. Island cats that preyed on the lizards soon began dying as well, leading to an explosion of the rodent population as their natural predator died off. Plague carried by fleas on the rodents was a serious threat to the islanders until the British Air Force, on request by the World Health Organization, parachuted cats onto Borneo. Yeah, so this is a great example of a pesticide killing non-target organisms and wreaking havoc on food chains and food webs because of things dying. So mosquitoes ended up causing the lizards to die because of them eating mosquitoes that were exposed to the pesticide. And then that resulted in the cats dying as they ate lizards. And then as a result, rodents are able to just run wild because there's no cats to keep their population in check. So kind of a fascinating example. Here's a video about this, fun to watch. Okay, let's talk about biomagnification a little bit more. I've already kind of covered it, but biomagnification, the idea is that it's the process whereby chemicals accumulate in the tissue of organisms along the food chain. Lower concentrations will be found in lower trophic levels, so at the bottom of the food chain, so your producers and your primary consumers. But as you get higher and higher and higher up the food chain, the concentration ends up being higher as well. And the idea is that every single time they eat something, right, then that chemical is being stored inside of them. So when we have things that are high up on the food chain, they eat a lot of stuff. They've eaten a lot of things in their life. So if all the pollutants that they've eaten are not getting broken down in their body, but it's just sticking around because they have no way to metabolize it, then over time it's going to accumulate. Typically it accumulates in the fatty tissues of that organism. And as a result, we end up getting then a higher concentration in large than smaller organisms. This actually is something that even ties into food that you eat. So a great example of this is mercury concentration in fish. So larger fish that have eaten more fish will have a higher mercury concentration than smaller fish. So for example, if you take a look at something like tuna, which is a very large fish, tuna is huge, okay? Tuna is going to have a higher mercury concentration than, let's say, cod, okay? Or salmon, okay? Just simply because of the fact that tuna is such a large fish that ends up having more biomagnification of mercury taking place. Okay, moving forward, here is a great diagram showing the concentration of DDT as we go up the food chain. I think we already looked at something like this. I know that we did. But as we go up the food chain, the concentration gets higher and higher. So this bird of prey, the osprey, is ending up having the highest DDT concentration because of bioaccumulation, because it eats many meals, and those many meals had a large amount of DDT in them, so it accumulates in the bird. Okay, moving forward. So the upside of DDT, why was it used? Why is it still used? Well, the good thing is it actually saved a lot of lives from malaria. Malaria incidences dropped from 70% in 1958 to 5% in 1964. So the amount of people getting malaria went down drastically with DDT killing many of the mosquitoes. The World Health Organization tested different chemicals to replace DDT, but none were as effective nor as cheap as DDT was. So the next question is, why would cost be important? Well, for malaria, many of the areas that actually have big problems with malaria end up also having not huge amounts of money, right? Developing countries. So they can't afford super pricey pesticides for government programs to try to take care of a mosquito population that is making malaria travel through their population. So instead, they use the cheapest option, which would be DDT. And DDT is still used around the world, even though it has negative health effects, okay, as you learned about in the reading that you did. Pesticide resistance is something else to talk about while we're on the topic of pesticides. By using pesticides, we're creating a problem that pests are being exposed to pesticides and they are actually surviving and then reproducing and passing on the genes for resistance to the next generation. So we have produced insect populations that are resistant to certain pesticides. If their parents were not affected by the chemicals and they passed on their genes to the offspring, then a greater number of members in the population will not be affected by that pesticide. So as a result, new pesticides must constantly be developed and used in order to actually kill the pests. So sometimes multiple pesticides will actually be used to make sure that they take care of a pest population that they're trying to get rid of. This might remind you of the antibiotic resistance stuff. It's the same idea, right? If we overuse antibiotics, then what happens is the bacteria gets used to it. Okay, essentially it adapts to not be sensitive to the antibiotic anymore, and then we get superbugs. Well, this is the same thing, but we're getting super insects that are not affected anymore by the pesticide. And this is just due to natural, I don't want to say natural selection, it's almost artificial selection, that as we expose pests to pesticides, the ones that end up surviving the pesticide exposure pass on their genes with whatever resistance they have to the next generation. Then the next generation happens again. And then eventually we get these insects that just aren't actually affected by the pesticides that we're using anymore. So this is where different farming practices really help. Like, for example, changing the crop in a field each year. Also having multiple crops in a field and not mono, meaning one, monoculture crops. That really helps. And that actually kind of feeds into the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is organic farming. So just really brief on organic farming. Organic agriculture uses natural processes and cycles to minimize environmental damage and to optimize productivity. So the idea is for organic farming is to try to do farming without using chemicals that we know are harmful to non-target species, and essentially just to be friendly to the environment and so on. So yeah, and as a result, yields go down typically for organic farming. Prices end up being higher for organic produce and so on. But the idea is that less chemicals that are harmful are used. Here's a little blurb from the National Standard of Canada for Organic Agriculture. Operators of organic enterprises strive to reduce or eliminate reliance on practices using natural or synthetic-based compounds that harm beneficial organisms within the soil, deplete non-renewable resources, compromise water and air quality, or which, through misuses, could endanger the health of agriculture workers, the agricultural community, or the consumer. So the idea is just trying to minimize harm as much as possible. One kind of pet peeve that, to watch out for is, oh, they don't use chemicals. Well, I mean, everything is a chemical. They use chemicals, right? But they just don't use chemicals necessarily that have harm on non-target species or humans typically, or whatever. Now, the big kind of debate is normal produce fine? There are guidelines for how much pesticide can be present on normal produce, how much can be used, and that sort of thing. And there's guidelines and studies to back it up. So based on what we know and our understanding, most of the time when we take a look at normal produce, it isn't harmful what's on there if there is any residual, especially after a good washing. So then for organic stuff, right, organic produce, does it have a real benefit over normal produce? And also, if every single farm in the world was organic, if that's all we did, we would not be able to feed as many people. So there's an issue with that as well. So a lot of questions around this. There's pros and cons, a whole debate, and we might do a little bit of an assignment around this in the future to kind of take a look at the pros and cons for organic and some other stuff around pesticides. All right, so what did you learn today? You learned about the 3 different types of pesticides that we are dealing with: insecticides, fungicides, herbicides. You learned about the idea of persistent, meaning that it doesn't break down easily in the environment. You learned about DDT as kind of a case study of a pesticide that was quite bad, but was widely used, and the effects it had on food webs. You learned about biomagnification, also called bioaccumulation, which is the process of chemicals building up in a food chain. And you have a higher concentration at higher trophic levels at the top of the food chain, and a lower concentration at lower trophic levels at the bottom of the food chain. What else did you learn about? You learned about organic farming and a little bit about how that works in comparison to normal farming. And I think that's it. All right, have a good rest of your day.